Excellent. Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Eloise, as you may have heard me and Nikita rambling on. I'm one of the coordinators here at PsychologyAtWork.blog. This is actually the fourth, I believe, research symposium event that we have hosted now. So essentially the purpose, if you're unfamiliar, is we open up to people in the community that have recently completed masters or PhDs, or perhaps even undergrad research, to come along, give us a short summary, a flavour of what research is going on in the community at in our institutions around the country. And I think we have even had research from outside of the UK as well, which is excellent. So yeah, I'm not going to waffle for too long. What we'll do, basically the structure is we'll have 5 to 10 minutes to present, and then we'll open up the floor to questions, reflections, discussion. It's not too formal. It really is just a just an opportunity to bring people together to discuss research, see if there's any new methods and ideas going around, at the emerging Oxide kind of level. So yeah, as you may have caught the end of, we have 3 presentations today. So we have Laura, Lauren, and myself. We haven't discussed an order actually, but I was thinking, since Lauren and I think we both were looked at sort of hybrid working, remote working, I may put Laura on the spot and say, would you like to present first?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine if everyone's in agreement.
Yep, lovely, thank you.
Okay, so I'll share my PowerPoint slides next of all then. I'm just going to put it in presenter mode first. Can I do that? Okay, now I do that next. Perfect.
Excellent, we can see that.
Okay. So this pesky Zoom bar's covering my present.
You think this far into the pandemic, well, post-pandemic, we would have it covered, but
there you go. There you go. How's that looking?
Excellent. We can just see your slide.
Brilliant. So thank you very much for that introduction, Eloise and Nikita. I'm Laura Howard. I studied a master's in organisational psychology quite recently. So I submitted this thesis in September last year, 2022. So I got my final degree award notification in December. So my research concentrated on senior women leaders and their constructions of authenticity within the workplace. So I'll walk you through my presentation next of all. I hope you find it interesting. So the aims of my study, I concentrated on the professional services sector, which is a sector that I've worked in for 20 years. So in terms of a data set, I had affinity and a network with that group, but also some lived experience putting myself, situating myself within that research as one of the subjects. So when I say professional services, I'm talking about accountancy, finance, marketing, legal, those types of industries. So I also wanted to look at what factors influence women to become authentic or inauthentic, and how widespread barriers are to women becoming their whole authentic self within workplace, and what work outcomes happened. I'll show you a few quotes from my research, so that'll bring those into focus a bit more. So yeah, moving on, I did semi-structured interviews among 13 respondents. They range from age from 34 to 60 years of age, so there's quite a cross-section of expertise and track record there, and endless examples. Some of the women I could have spoke to for hours upon end. So I did a thematic analysis using the Braun and Clark methodology as well. So when I do this presentation to business groups and EDI networks, women's networks in corporates, I ask them to put in the Zoom chat, you know, what they mean by authenticity. I won't do that today in the interest of time, but they use words like uniqueness, your true self, your whole self, those types of words. But actually within my dissertation, this is the definition that I shared to contextualize the study. So authentic leaders possess self-awareness, therefore acting them true selves. They act in alignment with their values, embody high morals, and promote trust amongst followers. I'll add to that. And when I was doing my research, the whole values piece was very much prominent, and acting within with congruence with one's values was particularly relevant amongst answers and a point of contention amongst my respondents, impacting their careers. So within my literature review, these are the sorts of things that I looked at. So women are theorized to be held to high standards, so higher standards than one might reasonably accept a male counterpart to be held to. You know, an example of this was in recent public press. You might have seen Holly Willoughby's salary was, you know, blasted all over the tabloids. Well, you know, my approach was so what? She's a professional in that presenting field. Would a man's salary be you know, such a headline grabber on those publications? You know, they're considered unleaderlike. This particularly presents in things like promotion opportunities or recruitment and selection. This is in line with Alice Egley's work about role incongruity theory, where women aren't necessarily considered leader-like and therefore incongruent within that profession. Conversely, they are considered optimum in a crisis. So for those familiar, this is Ryan's work on the glass cliff phenomenon. An example of that might be, for example, Theresa May being placed in the Tory leadership and therefore prime ministerial role after the Brexit vote, and therefore the crisis of putting all those pieces back together within politics. And the next piece of work that I used as an important lens was that organisations are not gender neutral within their construction. So this was really important because of my professional services context of the study. Because, you know, if you imagine a traditional solicitor's firm, for example, and the traditional partner role, that is very much within a male-dominated spectrum. So, and last of all, you know, cautious about revealing them true selves. So this This is informed by some theorizing on imposter phenomenon, for example. You know, do I feel that I can reveal all of myself in this senior role? You know, do I need to conceal that I'm leaving work 15 minutes early to go and pick up my child, for instance? Can I be transparent about that? So again, when I do this presentation out there in the wild, I invite those on the call to give me their perspectives as whom they deem authentic senior women leaders. And you know, I get all sorts of answers from Karen Brady through to Dolly Parton, through to politicians, media presenters. But these are two that were quite current when I was writing my dissertation, and they're two that I wrote about within the lens of my study. So I'm going to share with you the outcome of my thematic analysis next of all. Oops, not that one. So I, after a period of coding and recoding and drawing themes, I concluded with these 4 top-level themes and subsequent next level themes. So again, just reminding you about my research question: what influences, how does women's authenticity develop and approach? So I discovered that power structures were significant within my research. So for instance, powerful individuals, now that could be role models or leaders or shareholders, for instance, those often set the tone for how authentic one could be within their personas. And when I talk about powerful schema, that relates back to Atker's work on the gendered organisation. The final sub-theme there was very much on subjugating events. So this might be promotion conversations or even demotion conversations that happened as a result of the woman, you know, standing firm on some of their values-laden decision-making. I've got a few quotes to show you on that, hopefully time permitting. Do let me know, Eloise, if I need to speed up. So second of all, fit to belong. You know, this is something that's really significant in the literature. Senior women leaders may not feel that they want to reveal all of their selves, like I said, concealing leaving work early, for instance. And I would often, I found often that my participants would perform chameleon-like within the organisation, depending on the context that they were faced with, you know, in a particular meeting or a particular high-profile project, for instance. And where I live in Derbyshire, it's like "A up me duck." You might have heard that. So the chameleon was likened to a duck as well, in that regard. And yeah, does she fit? This was quite a pivotal sub-theme, because participants would often fall into 2 categories, and that is they would gain surety in their career and hold strong with their values, and that would be sort of mirrored back to them and become normalized, if you like, within their organizational context. So they would stay in their careers, but another group would break away and create their own small practice, their own small business in their defined discipline. So the third theme was influential femininity. So this was very much around, if you think about mothers and daughters being role models and sources of inspiration and perspective for the senior women, that was often career altering, either the advice from a mother or becoming a mother themselves. Feminine expression was very much around choosing to reveal those what would be deemed in some organizations as, overly emotional moments or overly emotional women, but actually created a reciprocity and a trust, particularly when one of the senior women had a team and noticed some vulnerabilities within the team. That was very much a positive outcome for followers. And fempowerment, this is very much about leaders whom empowered their teams through their own unique femininity, and this generated a source of loyalty amongst the team members of the women leaders. So last of all is very much through her evolution. So this theme considers self-awareness. So this is the woman gaining confidence and surety as she progresses through her career path. And women would talk to me and tell me about, in the early years, they wouldn't call out sex discrimination, they wouldn't call out racism. They were very much under the cosh to establish themselves in their career. They had a mortgage, they had bills, they were very much unstable, let's say, within their careers. But as they got older and matured within their profession, that surety came. And mirror is very much about that mirror to that woman's capability. So if you think about promotion decisions, board nominations, securing awards, that was about that recognition and validation of that particular woman, and therefore gaining that surety and evolving into her authentic self. So I provided this map within my dissertation. So this is the interaction of the themes. One author I discovered suggested creating a heroic theme within one's thematic analysis. So, my hero theme was evolving authenticity, that top one there, and that very much interacted with the influential femininity as a resource to fuel the evolving authenticity. Power structures very much hindered her authenticity, and fit to belong was ever evolving, ever changing as that woman was altering her persona through authenticity. So yeah, I'll just share these with you quickly. The top one is very much about a participant's experience where one of her staff died suddenly in a car accident. She worked in a major high street bank, and because the team was so close, they were deeply grieving, and this was a horrendous period for her team. She was supporting them. But the headquarters were imposing significant financial targets. So this wasn't just about the day-to-day banking, this was add-on products such as insurance, and she pushed back. She said, this isn't the right time to ask the team to upsell this product, and she ended up being pushed sideways as a result. And the second quote talks about that reference to a duck. So my participant was being mentored by her chairman through a buyout of her organisation that she was working in. And in the book, he'd written, as it says, walk like a duck, talk like a duck, eventually you will feel like a duck. So he felt it relevant to write this and give this in a book to you know, almost indoctrinate her into a way of thinking, which was an emasculated, you know, a masculine way of thinking. There's also some quotations here about pinpointing what some of these masculine organisations perceived as overtly feminine ways of being in the office, and how they were challenged and considered incongruent with that woman's promotion journey upwards. But there was also some positives as well within this research in terms of loyalty that teams felt, as I mentioned before. So in the interest of time, I'll just leave my recommendations there, which was my final section of my research, namely to consider studying the link between quality of careers and authenticity, and how they are potentially connected through additional research methods. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. Let me just...
I'm conscious there's 2 more presentations to go,
No,
so
okay.
I felt that was very hurried, but you're welcome to connect with me after, and I'm happy to, you know, talk to you about this separately, any of you.
I can tell you're very passionate about the topic and where it's going. Has anyone got any questions that they might want to cover before we move on to Lauren's presentation? We have time, so don't be shy. You're more than welcome to ask any questions that you might have. I have just one before we move on then. Laura, where do you see this research? I think it might have been covered where you just brushed over those recommendations, but where do you see this research going forwards now, and perhaps what are you doing to sort of take this forwards and disseminate it wider?
Yeah, thank you, Eloise. I think it's quite the reason that I identified a gap in the existing literature is because there's much more presence in the public eye of authentic, seemingly authentic women leaders. So if you think about Jacinda Ardern, for example, who obviously more recently has decided to step down, which is another conversation for another day. But you know, we're seeing much more transparency and overtly or authentic women leaders. So what's next with my research is my professors invited me to submit a manuscript to the International Coaching Psychology Review, which I'm really excited about. And I'm also guest speaking to a number of women's networks within large corporate organizations as to how they can sort of shine a light on some of these practices, so bring them to the conscious of more senior leaders, senior boards within organizations. So if anyone on the call thinks that's relevant to their organization, I'd be very happy to chat afterwards.
Excellent, amazing work, incredible. And I think you did touch on over it, but you are happy for people to reach out to you on LinkedIn if they want to, if you want to maybe pop your name in the chat, and then people know where to look. Thank you so much, Laura. Excellent. Okay, moving on swiftly then, Lauren, would you like to come and introduce your research and tell us a little bit about what you did?
Brilliant, thanks Eloise. Right, I'll just get my slides up. Do you recommend sharing screen or sharing file, or does it not matter too much?
Laura might be the expert.
I did screen,
yeah,
Lauren.
Screen. Okay, I'll just stick with screen. I think that's easier. Okay. Right, can everybody see that?
Yeah, I can see it.
Excellent. Okay, this means I can't see my time, so I'll try not to talk for too long, but Eloise, do stop me if I'm rambling on. Right, so thank you for inviting me along tonight, Eloise, and thank you very much, Laura, for that presentation. It was so interesting to hear about your research. So I'm here today to talk about my research project, which I recently completed as part of my Master's in Organisational Psychology at Birkbeck, where I studied with Laura as well. And I finished that towards the end of last year. And the topic that I focused on was hybrid working. And my title was Exploring the Relationships Between Remote Working Frequency, Wellbeing, Autonomy, and Job Crafting in Hybrid Workers. So in terms of the context for the study, it's a context that I'm sure everybody is very familiar with, but the global COVID-19 pandemic. And in the UK, we had a series of national lockdowns, and they prompted a really dramatic surge in involuntary working from home. So to put a few figures to that, before the pandemic, or just before, the ONS estimated that there were about 5% of the workforce working from home. And then this surged up to around 50% in April 2020. And then soon after the easing of restrictions in early 22, around May 22, that had come back down to about 25%. So 1 in 4 workers still working from home. So that's still 5 times higher than before the pandemic. And following the easing of restrictions, the government looked at various polls, and a lot of the big consultancies as well did surveys, and it was clear that there'd been a real shift in employee sentiment towards working from home. And now most of the employees that had worked from home during the pandemic, at that point in time, they wanted to continue doing so. So I think an ONS survey found that 84% of people said they wanted to continue working from home for at least some of the week. So organisations reacted to that by many of them establishing what they called hybrid working policies, which was where employees can divide their time between working in work premises, such as offices, and remote work. And the term hybrid working is actually quite novel. I didn't come across it much when I was doing my research. It used to really just be referred to as remote working. But hybrid working specifically tends to refer to a policy which has some form of flexibility in it. So where people can have some element of choice and control over whether they're working from an office location or from home. In terms of how different organisations are putting these policies in place, there's quite a big difference in the level of choice and control that they're giving to their colleagues. So I'm sure everyone here has kind of been in one of those conversations where people say, oh, so how are you? And are you working from home at the moment? Do you go into the office? Is that because you have to do that? Or is it because you want to do that? And it's not obvious really, what people are doing. And it's also not clear what the optimum working pattern is, if there really is one. But if you look at past research on remote working, in general, studies found a positive correlation between the number of days worked remotely and well-being. So that's what the research says, but the context has changed so dramatically that it's unclear now whether those findings remain relevant. So for my study, I explored the well-being of UK hybrid workers in a post-COVID era, but I specifically examined the relationship between the number of days that they worked remotely and their well-being. I also looked at how perceived autonomy and job crafting can impact that relationship. So in case anyone's unfamiliar with those terms, autonomy is the perceived freedom and control to decide how and when to perform one's work activities. And job crafting refers to proactive behaviours that employees can use to redefine and shape their job characteristics to improve the job person fit of their role. So really to shape the job to their own preferences and skills. And that's been shown to enhance well-being. So it's quite difficult to summarise all of my literature review on one slide, but I've managed to do it. So in terms of the research findings before the study on remote working and well-being, there really is extensive evidence that remote working has a positive impact on well-being in most cases. Remote working it's positively linked to autonomy, which is a key component of well-being. Anyone familiar with self-determination theory will have come across that. And often the job demands resources model is used to help explain why remote working is beneficial for well-being. So remote working can provide important resources that help employees to meet the demands of their role. So they could be things like autonomy, it could be an environment that is better designed to their preferences, so perhaps fewer distractions. It could be increased time from lack of a commute. So various different resources. And in my study, I looked specifically at eudaimonic well-being, which refers to meaningfulness, purpose, and growth. And that's as opposed to hedonic well-being, which focuses more on positive emotions and minimizing negative emotions. Both are very important when you're studying well-being, but I picked eudaimonic because it's under-researched when in the field of remote working, but it is highly relevant because eudaimonic well-being includes two main elements, so interpersonal well-being and intrapersonal. Interpersonal relates to social well-being, which is very relevant for hybrid working because you know, the element of physical proximity to one's colleagues or not. And then intrapersonal well-being refers more to feelings of autonomy and meaningfulness of work and growth. And again, with hybrid working, because you're changing the nature of the work, you know, where you're doing it and how you're doing your role, intrapersonal well-being is very relevant as well. So I decided to focus on that aspect. So despite the benefits that remote working can have, there are some pitfalls that for some people, they can find that their well-being is negatively impacted, if particularly if they're remote working quite a lot. And I kind of group those into two main categories. So the first one is work intensification. So this can come about where people perhaps are having difficulty in managing their work and home boundaries, and it results in them working longer and harder than they may have done if they were at the office. Also techno overload. So when you're remote working, you use technology in order to communicate with others. And because of the design of the technologies that we often use, this can, you know, can be quite addictive, and it can cause us as well to work longer and harder than we would have otherwise done. And also there can be stresses around when technology doesn't work. I'm sure we've all, you know, now have the daily, oh, you're on mute situation that is now so familiar to us all. So this can lead to strain and a greater risk of stress and burnout. So it's not something that everybody experiences, but it is a risk that, you know, has come up quite a lot in the past research. The other main risk is isolation. So that one kind of speaks for itself, but if people are working from home, they're not in physical proximity to their colleagues and they're more at risk of becoming isolated. So in terms of remote working frequency, which is the construct that I studied specifically, most studies found that the more number of days per week that you worked from home, the better your well-being. So it was a positive linear relationship. And that's, there's a few meta-analyses that have found that result. But there are also a significant number of studies that found evidence to suggest a curvilinear relationship. So as people work from home more, their well-being increases, but then as they get to kind of 4 or 5 days a week, the well-being starts to dip. And the reason that they theorized that to explain this was because of those risks. So as you're working from home more, you've got more exposure to the benefits and those additional resources. You've also got more exposure to those risks, and so for some people that damages their well-being. So to summarize briefly the literature on autonomy and job crafting with remote working. So with autonomy, the research has found that remote working frequency is positively correlated to autonomy. So the more that people are away from the office, the more autonomy they perceive. And then with job crafting, it's been found to be positively correlated with well-being in a sample of remote workers and hybrid workers. But there aren't really many studies on the frequency of remote working and well-being. I actually couldn't find any. But job crafting is particularly relevant for hybrid working because it requires autonomy. And remote working is all about, hybrid working is all about choosing where you work and shaping your own role around that proactively. And that's exactly what job crafting is as well. So in terms of the hypotheses that I had, so I made predictions in line with the past literature. So that was that remote working frequency will be positively related to well-being for hybrid workers. And then I looked at autonomy and job crafting as potential moderators of that relationship, so that as remote working frequency went up, both of those would strengthen the relationship with well-being. So what did I find? Oh no, firstly, just a summary of my method and sample. So in terms of the method, it was a quantitative survey, so quite different to the study that Laura did. I used Qualtrics, I used validated and peer-reviewed academic scales, which I'm happy to share with people if anyone's interested to see which ones I used. The well-being one was particularly interesting because it was the only one that was workplace specific and eudaimonic well-being specific. So that was quite interesting. It was a positivist paradigm and objectivist in line with the quantitative approach. And I collected my data over the summer months last year. And in terms of sampling, I used an opportunity sampling approach. So really just promoting the survey on my LinkedIn and sending it out to contacts. And my sample, in the end, it was 139 UK-based hybrid workers. 95 of those are from Aon, which is my employer, a professional services firm. The sample was relatively well balanced across the other key demographic variables that I looked at. So quite well balanced across genders, also whether they had dependents or not. The majority of respondents were junior or middle managers, but we also had some analysts and some execs as well. Most people had been with their employer for at least a couple of years, with commute length, again, quite well balanced between ones that had over an hour commute or less than an hour commute. But then in terms of the industry, there was a big bias towards financial services and professional services, with 80% of the sample being from those industries. The other 20% were quite evenly split across lots of different industries. So now, what did I find? So I found that there was no relationship between the frequency of remote working and well-being. So that was really interesting because it completely contradicted the past research. So there were a few ideas that I had which could explain why this was the result. So firstly, potentially an explanation is that flexibility is actually a more important factor for well-being than the number of days that people actually work from home. So if I looked at the level of autonomy for the sample, it was very high. So it was a Likert scale rating, and the average was 4.4 for everybody. So that showed that out of my sample of hybrid workers, all of them felt that they had very high autonomy. I also asked some questions around the perceived flexibility that colleagues had, or that people had to choose their working patterns. And 43% said they had absolutely no restrictions on how often they worked at home or from the office. So that's really high in terms of flexibility as well. So given that one of the main reasons that remote working has been found to positively impact well-being in the past is through the medium of autonomy, one explanation for this result could be that people feel autonomy whether they're working from home frequently or not when they've got a hybrid working policy with high flexibility. Another explanation for this lack of relationship could be as well that there have just been so many contextual changes since the pandemic. So before the pandemic, I think remote working was not so normalized. So it was more predictable to make claims such as you'll have fewer distractions when you're working from home, and you'll have better social well-being and more interactions with others at the office. These things are not now as predictable now that footfall in offices is much lower. Often when people go in, they have to be on video calls all day, so they may not talk a lot to their colleagues. And people at homes, they might be working now at home with other people, so they might be disturbed quite frequently. So it may be that those changes just mean that the previous relationship doesn't hold anymore. Also, this sample looked only at workers whose whole organisations had an explicit hybrid working policy for everybody. Previously in studies, they often looked at remote workers and either didn't say whether everybody in that organization had the same rules, or they said, you know, it was just specific people that had asked to remote work. So I think that makes a difference, because we're now looking at a sample where it includes people who perhaps don't want remote work. So it might be better for their well-being not to be remote working as frequently. Therefore, that previous positive relationships not being found anymore. The other key finds I had were that there were no moderating effects for either autonomy or job crafting. For the autonomy data, it was very skewed because everybody reported such high autonomy. So I think that can be quite cautiously approached, that result, because it just was too skewed really for the linear regressions to be accurate. And then on the job crafting side, I think it would be reasonable to expect that job crafting may now be similarly important for both people working more often from home and from the office, now that remote working and this hybrid working work pattern is more normalized, and everybody is essentially allowed to do it in the firms of the sample that we're looking at. And then the final finding was that job crafting was significantly positively correlated to well-being. So there's two types of job crafting I looked at: relational crafting, and that again was most strongly linked to interpersonal well-being, which makes sense because relational crafting involves deciding how you interact with people, where you do it, and how often you do it. Task crafting was most strongly linked to intrapersonal. So again, that made sense because the task crafting involves changing the way that you do your job, which will impact, you know, and the actual tasks that you do, which will impact people's experience of meaningfulness and growth. So this was just a quick chart to show you something quite interesting. So where people felt that they had greater control over their remote working patterns, so as you go down the table, that's the control they felt goes up. Their well-being scores were higher consistently across interpersonal and intrapersonal well-being. So just to summarize then with conclusions and some recommendations. So I found no evidence of an optimal hybrid working pattern for well-being. So the implications there for organizations are, if you are implementing a hybrid working policy with the specific aim of supporting the well-being of your employees, you may get the greatest benefits by maximizing the flexibility of that policy, obviously as far as is commercially feasible, because that recognizes that the optimal working pattern will vary on an individual and team basis. Secondly, the findings suggest that perhaps flexibility may be more important for hybrid workers' well-being than the frequency of remote working. So by offering a flexible approach, it allows employees to select the pattern which most effectively supports them to meet the demands of their role, and also to access resources as they need to from their work and home environments. And then finally, job crafting was linked significantly to well-being for hybrid workers, regardless of how often they work from home. So my recommendation would be that organisations should train their hybrid workers in job crafting, let them know what it is, how to do it, and let them know that that could be good for their well-being. So that is it.
Thank you so much, Lauren.
Stop sharing so I can see everybody.
Let me just like this. Excellent, thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions or reflections? Anything they might want to ask Lauren?
I wanted to ask about did you call it relational job crafting?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Could you tell me a bit about a bit more about how that factored into your study design and where you got that inspiration from the literature?
Yeah, sure. So there are actually various different ways of measuring job crafting. So I picked one specifically which had these subdimensions of relational crafting and task crafting. And there's actually a third one called cognitive crafting, which I didn't look at, because I just thought it's such a key factor in hybrid working. You know, because people are away from their colleagues. So that's one of the main things that I saw in the literature of people saying about the isolation and the lack of those water cooler chats. And so I wanted to dig into, you know, for people out there who are making the effort to set up virtual water coolers or to do some relational crafting in terms of changing the way that they work to change the way that they interact with their colleagues, to see whether that is having an impact on their well-being, and it did appear to be having it. So so yeah, I thought that was quite interesting.
Sounds brilliant. Well done, Lauren.
Oh, thank you, Laura.
Amazing job. I maybe perhaps biased. It's really interesting because when I was sort of creating my ideas for my study as well, I remember thinking about this whole flexibility and control sort of piece. So really interesting to hear you say that actually you reckon that actually control and flexibility does have a play in there on well-being and sort of how people perceive hybrid working. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that would be such an interesting avenue for further study, just to look more deeply into that factor, because I asked the questions on flexibility and control more as, I guess, kind of to get some background information to help me with interpreting the results, rather than having those as the key constructs and the key study variables. But I'd love to do some further research which actually looked at those as the key variables, because I think it would be really interesting.
Yeah, definitely agree. I am going to plough ahead with presenting mine, only because I do think it really nicely complements Lauren's research, because I kind of looked at virtuality and subjective virtuality, which I think plays into that flexibility and idea of control piece. Do recognise that we're going to finish at 7, so if you do need to drop off, that's fine. The session has been recorded and we will be putting it up on LinkedIn and YouTube, so you will be able to catch the end if you do need to leave a little bit earlier today. Right, now I've got to awkwardly faff about with trying to present screen. What can you see? Just my application?
Yeah, we can see your whole PowerPoint screen.
How about now? Just the screen? Perfect. I've been working like across 2 monitors, so can you see like just the slide now?
Just the slide, yeah. Although
Excellent.
we can see, it looks like the normal PowerPoint application. So I guess if there were notes on other slides, we would be able to see them.
Are you able to begin the slideshow, Eloise?
Yeah, I have. It's on one screen, but not the one that I expected it to be on. Okay.
Interesting.
Let me just change that. Sorry, technical difficulties. Can you see just the normal one now? Or is it still the double one?
Yeah, I can still see the toolbar at the top. But we could.
Are you on what slide? Can you see the first one or overview?
The first one.
Or is it this one we're on? Okay, might have to just go with it like that.
Yeah, we can still see it like that as well.
Okay, nice. Okay, so yeah, the title of my study is You Can Only Trust Someone You Feel You Know, and I looked at the relationship between team perceived virtuality, trust, team characteristics, and effectiveness. I thought an effective way to sort of introduce the study, rather than attempting to try and consolidate the whole lit review, kind of just talk about my journey into this research idea and kind of where my interest came from. So a love for sport and sports coaching. I'm very interested in team dynamics as well, and particularly team dynamics in the workplace. And that kind of led me down a similar avenue to Lauren in the aftermath of COVID. What's happening to all these teams and how are they now interacting in the virtual environment, and how does hybrid working and virtual working impact that? Sorry, 2 seconds. yeah, so I started exploring the literature on hybrid working and this concept of virtuality, and came really across two ways of looking at virtuality. So you either have this structural or objective kind of view that really, looks at a number of face-to-face meetings, media richness, how you're talking, how you're communicating with each other. Are you using Zoom calls? Are you using emails? I mean, some of the papers even had actual calculations of distance and from offices, how far each individual in this hybrid team. It's a very objective and structural way of looking at this. But then there was another avenue which took a more subjective approach. So how, and one of the most notable one, and the one that I sort of pursued for this this study, was team perceived virtuality, so TPV. And that had two dimensions, an affective state and a cognitive state. The affective state being feelings of distance, so how you perceive distance between you and your team members, and then perception of information deficit. So do you feel like you're not getting the information from your team members that you need to work effectively? Okay, so moving on very swiftly to the methodology. This was a multi-method cross-sectional survey, 120 participants, largely from one organisation, but there was a little bit of opportunity sampling through my LinkedIn too to try and boost those numbers. I used regression and mediation for the analysis, and my outcome of interest, as I've already alluded to, was team effectiveness, and my predictor there was perceived virtuality, and obviously using team trust as a mediator there, really, because during my my review of the literature, it was clear that trust had a big part to play in team effectiveness, and that actually virtuality and hybrid working, remote working also had a part to play in trust. So I was looking really there to what part does trust play in that relationship between hybrid working individuals who perceive themselves to be very virtual from their team members, and how that impacts on effectiveness. And I also looked at several control variables, team characteristics, so team size, tenure, task interdependence. But in addition to that, I also had just one sort of open question, see if I could find any findings that might support or add some context to any of the findings coming out of the quant. So yeah, just looking for experiential data on trust, effectiveness, and hybrid working or remote teams. I am assuming that my slides are moving on as I'm clicking. Okay, excellent. So I had 3 hypotheses here and kind of one research question. So my first hypothesis was that a higher perception of team virtuality will predict lower levels of team trust. So the more virtual you feel, the less trust is going to be in that team. This was supported by the regression. So as a combined factor, combining feelings of distance and perceptions of information deficit, this predicted about 40% of variance in trust, quite a significant amount of variance here. So quite a large link. Both sub sort of factors of this virtuality scale had significant influence over trust too when I sort of looked at them individually. Moving on to hypothesis 2, that a higher perception of team virtuality will predict lower self-rated effectiveness. As a combined scale, this also was significant, although the evidently the variance is a little bit lower in this sort of relationship here. And interestingly, when you split them out, only perception of information deficit significantly accounted to that variance there in effectiveness. So feelings of distance didn't have a significant result, although saying that it did near on significance, but yeah, not significance all the same. And team size also had an interesting effect there, although research perhaps suggested that team size wouldn't have necessarily had an effect on effectiveness. It was negatively predictive here. And then my third hypothesis was around this sort of mediating effect of trust on this relationship. And from this table here, I'm actually going to just pop up my notes. You might be able to see them. So yeah, so as you can see across the bottom, the C- pathway is non-significant, which actually means that when controlling for trust, the relationship between TPV and effectiveness is non-significant. So that means when you sort of dig deeper into the data there, that actually trust, from this analysis, it found that trust was the factor that brought about this negative impact of virtuality on effectiveness, which is interesting here because it does highlight the role of trust in teams, and how it's not necessarily the virtuality that has the impact, but it's the impact that virtuality could have on trust that impacts the effectiveness. So coming out from these, from the qual sort of open-ended question on the end, I did a conventional content analysis, so a little bit higher level than a very deep thematic analysis, really looking at what kind of categories of comments there were in there. And there were 4 very clear categories, one of them being face-to-face contact and the value of face-to-face contact versus the value of computer-mediated communications, the CMC. And actually, although quite a high percentage of responses were coded here, there was also a high level of conflict. There were some people, there could have even been conflict within some of the singular responses. Some people saw the value in face-to-face contact, in those water cooler chats that Lauren, you've mentioned, in being able to see people as a way of building trusting relationships, but also found that sort of having that option for communicating via like technology and having hybrid working in that option was also beneficial for trust, because they felt that people were more open, there were lots more opportunities to chat with people, and like communication was a lot higher through these methods, because we've probably all seen it, the number of Zoom calls and all these meetings that you're pulled into on a day-to-day now, because we're so used to using video calls to communicate in this way. So they've also found that there's benefits to both sides, and actually some people preferred one while some people preferred the other, which I do really think feeds into this flexibility and control point, in that people have different preferences, and sort of prescribing one way to working doesn't actually work for all. And the effect that the benefits for the teams and team trust and effectiveness comes from people being able to mold their working practices and to their preferences and to the team's preferences and the needs of the team. There were some other interesting findings which came out of this, another being culture / expectation of trust. This was quite prevalent as well in the responses, sort of people stating that trust is essential and assumed, and that actually a lack of trusting behaviours in hybrid and remote teams can undermine the collective success of the team. Another interesting one being past experience. Quite a significant number of responses were coded in this way, and this kind of related to familiarity with each other being a way for people to build trust in these teams, and that people felt over time, as familiarity built up with each other, the trust increased, and that it helped increase effectiveness. But also, and this also fed into a sort of self-efficacy point, which we're all probably quite familiar with as a theory, and collective efficacy. So as your team succeeds in certain tasks, certain areas, that builds that efficacy in your team members, builds that trust in your team members, and that ultimately feeds into effectiveness. And an interesting one was a large portion of comments perceived there to be no risk of virtual and hybrid working on trust and effectiveness. They didn't see the link. But interestingly, actually 75% of these comments then went on to provide an example of how, I don't see a link because we just assume that there is trust, or I don't see a link because we meet each other regularly. So they proceeded to then give examples of some of these other 3 categories that may have actually, they might not have the risk, they might not be seeing hybrid working or remote working having an impact on their trust or effectiveness, because they put some of these other strategies into place, which I found very interesting. And just to sort of wrap up and conclude this kind of whistle-stop tour of my research, TPV was actually very new at the time of me conducting this study. So this is probably the first of its kind that was looking into what else what else does TPV interact with? How is it related to effectiveness? How is it related to trust? It confirms that there is a negative effect of TPV on trust and effectiveness, and that trust has a quite significant effect on that relationship between TPV and effectiveness. Interestingly, the team characteristics that I might have expected to have had a relationship, particularly task interdependence, didn't. I think in theory, if you perceive yourself to be more distant from your team members, you perceive that there are information deficits, being in a team that has a higher task interdependence, so you're relying on each other more to carry out tasks to then meet your goals, you would think that they would be the strength of relationship between TPV and effectiveness would be stronger in those teams which have higher task interdependence. Although I didn't find anything to that effect, potentially just the way that it was measured, or the sample, or so I think that's an interesting one to maybe take forwards and to have a look at in the future, the interaction of task interdependence there. And I think, just to go full circle, I started off the journey looking into virtuality and ways of measuring virtuality and how that kind of sits and looks, and kind of went down this avenue of actually maybe subjective virtuality is the preferable way to go now, because it all varies so much in terms of hybrid working. Now everyone has different types of hybrid working. It's really hard to stick an objective label on it. Let's go down this route with the subjective. The prevalence of the two camps, face-to-face contact or sort of working from home, computer mediated communication in those responses was quite striking to me, and you can see why it does prevail as a viable option for study, sort of splitting people up in this way. It does, so as I say, it does highlight why objective measures are so popular, but that in itself, that conflict demonstrates why it's really hard to stick a label on it in organizations and say you have to be doing this kind of working pattern, because the comments and also the quant findings show how actually it's more on a subjective basis, how you perceive your distance, how you perceive the information deficits, and that's where the impact on effectiveness comes from, potentially not so much from these objective measures, because the qual responses highlight that actually people have different ways of viewing it and different preferences, and feel that different levels impact on their trust and their effectiveness in different ways. So I'm going to conclude there, because I've rambled on for longer than I thought I was going to be able to, and just open it up to any final comments, and then we can shut off for the night.
I've got a question, Eloise, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Within this team virtuality on a spectrum, and we're increasingly told as practitioners about individualization of treatment towards employees. In your view, how does a line manager approach conditions for their team when therefore they're all individuals and they're all responding to virtuality as individuals? How does a line manager handle that when they might be responsible for a team of 15 people, let's say?
Yeah, no, and do you know what, it's the difficult decision that every line manager is having to deal with, right? How do you bring your team together, and when do you bring them together, and how do you do it in a way that's inclusive and considerate of everyone's preferences? And I think it does depend, I don't know, I guess perhaps trial and error, see what works, collaboration. It's that trust and that openness, isn't it? And if you have that trust and that openness in the team, then you can rely, and so you can rely on the team to be open with their views and their preferences, and you can, it's a challenge that the modern manager is having to face, and I don't think anyone's quite cracked it yet. But yes, I do find the whole 2 days in the office sort of policy very interesting. And as you say, Lauren, I can see it from your literature review sort of perspective with the negatives of remote working and isolation, that well-being. We're inherently social creatures, aren't we? So there are benefits to going into the office. It's a modern challenge. It's a challenge of 2023. Where do we draw the line? And I think this shows that there is an impact of virtuality on effectiveness, but it's not always necessarily the same for everyone. And it's just working out how to cater to the team's needs and to those within the team's needs.
Fascinating research. Thank you for sharing, Eloise.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's amazing how different your research was, but it came to kind of similar findings in that there is so much disparity between different people's preferences and the way that they view remote working. But I'm really interested now to find out more about this concept of virtuality, because I'd never come across that actually. So that must be quite new, but it's really interesting. So thank you. Actually, I did have a quick question. Did you survey whole teams, or did you do it on more of an individual basis, and then people could belong to lots of different teams?
Yeah, so that it was more on an individual basis, and kind of just your perception of how effective your team is, your perception of how distant you feel from your team, rather than looking within teams. I think that would have been quite interesting to see if there was any variation there in perceptions of effectiveness, perceptions of distance. But yeah, just not within scope of what I could carry out.
Yeah, that would have been quite difficult practically, because that's another thing that came out in mine, and that people may have a preference for a certain remote working or hybrid working pattern, but actually your experience is impacted by what everybody else in your team is doing. So I do think there needs to be more research as well on kind of team level studies. But I think your research on team concepts like this team perceived virtuality is a really interesting angle as well, because there's not a lot of that in the research, or not a lot of that in the literature around. So yeah, that's great.
I did find it a very difficult area to research, but I was trying to work out, how am I going to measure virtuality? How am I going to measure hybrid working in a way that makes sense, broader? But yeah, no, I found it particularly validating to listen to your research, because as you say, we did kind of come to similar conclusions, actually, with very different approaches and ways of looking at the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. If there are no final questions or reflections, thank you everyone who's come to listen today. Particular thank you to Lauren and Laura for coming to present. It's been amazing listening to what you've had to say and the other research going on. So well done, and thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Eloise.
This will be on YouTube soon, so keep an eye out if you want to watch back or share. Excellent. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.